Pete Steinberg, welcome to Partnering Leadership. I am thrilled to have you in this conversation with me.
I'm very excited to be here. Thank you.
Looking forward to it, Pete. Most especially, can't wait to hear some of your thoughts on leadership shock. Love that title. Using authenticity to navigate the hidden dangers of career success. Before we get to that, though, would love to know a little bit more about you, Pete. Whereabouts did you grow up, and how did your upbringing impact the kind of person you've become?
You can probably tell, Mahan, that I didn't grow up in America. I came over in 1994. So I grew up in England, just outside Cambridge, a small little village called Duxford that some people might know because it has an air museum that's there. My dad was a history professor, which is, I think, where I got a lot of my fascination for learning. And my mum actually was a professional actress and a bit of a what they would say now is a community activist, but started not for profits and those sorts of things. That's where I get my caring. So the caring about things and then caring about learning are the two things that I think are really important.
That is awesome. I imagine growing up, you must have been more familiar with a sport that is bigger in some parts of the world than here in the US, and that's rugby. You spent almost 20 years coaching rugby at Penn State. How did your love for the sport come about, and how did you end up coaching?
Oh, really interesting. I did not come from a rugby family. I learned to play rugby in spite of my parents. My parents wanted me to do music and drama and those sorts of things. I think I was 29 when my mum saw me play my first rugby game.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, but I also wasn't really very good. And I came to the States to both go to grad school, but also to play rugby. My dad was from New York City. And I thought, I'm a pretty mediocre rugby player, but the US isn't a very good national team. Maybe I can go to America, get my PhD, and play for the US. And I went to Penn State and found out that graduate students can't play. Because if graduate students could play, the college game would be filled with foreigners, and the college game is where most Americans really develop their rugby skills. So I found myself at the age of 23 in State College, which, as you probably know, Mahan, is in the middle of nowhere. There's no other rugby, there's nothing else around me. And so ended up curtailing my playing career and became a coach at the age of 23. And best thing that ever happened to me. Much better coach than I was a player. Became a good coach, was never a good rugby player. It's funny because I became the national team coach and I talked to friends that I went to high school with back in England. And they were like, did you play rugby? And that's because between the ages of 16 and 18, rugby was moved. When you turn 16, rugby doesn't play on Sundays anymore. You play on Saturdays. Saturdays is when my parents ran a music and drama workshop, and then you're not playing rugby. So all of my high school friends didn't even know I played rugby, and then all of a sudden I become the national team coach. Yeah, so I'm passionate about the sport, but I'm mostly passionate about women's rugby and the impact that women's rugby can have on women as they become leaders and they become their best selves.
I can't wait to hear some more about that as well, Pete. Now, I love the fact that you said you didn't play that much competitive rugby, but you became a great coach. My girls play volleyball, and a couple of the best coaches they've had never played volleyball. And I find that challenge in organizations as well. A lot of times they look for a person who has done a job well and trying to get them to be a manager and a coach. So for you, becoming a coach, you said it was an enriching experience, and obviously you were a very successful coach. What were the capabilities you had to have as a coach that were drastically different than a player of the game of rugby?
As a mediocre rugby player, I wasn't big and I wasn't particularly strong and I wasn't particularly fast. So I had to be smart. So I actually had to understand the game. So I think that's something that prepared me was I always had to think about the game. I had to be the smartest player to make the teams that I made. I actually think this is one of the unusual things of rugby. I don't often like sports analogies, Mahan, with business. But when I coached at the Women's World Cup in 2017 in Ireland, I sat in the stands. Like when you coach rugby, you have to empower your players to do everything. They have to make strategic decisions. They have to make tactical decisions. They have to manage the culture of the team. They have to lead people. They have to recover from mistakes.
You said something that just shocked me when you say leadership shock. I don't know much about rugby, but you were not on the sidelines.
It's a law. Yeah, you can't be on the sidelines. You have to be up in the stands. And so we're mic'd up with sort of our physios. And so they'll run out and someone will get injured. And we'll be like, on your way out, can you please tell the fly half to kick more or to look at this? Rugby is designed to be a player-centered sport. So as a coach, it cannot be about you. And I think one of my biggest attributes was I never thought I was important. It was always the player's journey. And I was just helping them along the journey. I actually recently took a bunch of KPMG senior partners to the Olympic training site to train with the women's sevens team, the Olympic team I coached in the Rio Olympics. And the coach there now is someone that I coached, and I still know some of the players. So I took them there to say, look, let's really go and spend some time with the Olympic team. And it's all about teamwork and how you be a better team member. I've worked with KPMG for about 8 years. And there are people that I've known for 8 years, and they turn up and they're like, hold on, you coached at the Olympics? I had no idea about that. And that's because I don't really talk about it. It's not about me. So I think the biggest attribute I had was that it wasn't about me. And so that allowed me to prepare the players in a way that was about them. And then I think that's also what really made me successful. I created teams that really understood how to lead for their goals and for their outcomes and to really work together. You said something, Mahan, which I think is absolutely impactful for leadership shock. And in leadership shock, when people transition, often they get selected for roles because of what they did in their previous role, not what they need to do in their future role. And so I think thinking about attributes and actually what are the attributes that are required in the future role and how we select for those is a way that organizations need to adjust in how they select leaders. And I think that leads to don't select a coach because they're a great player. Select a coach because they have the attributes to be a great coach.
I couldn't agree with you more, Pete. Now I can visualize the audience, whether they are walking their dogs or driving their car, nodding and agreeing exactly with the point you made, because every time I talk to a CEO or an executive, they totally agree that you don't take the best performer and promote them to manager. It never works that way. You look at the attributes that are required. But truth be told, if I look at vast majority of organizations I've dealt with, they still practice that.
This is really interesting. So this is a measurement issue. It's a metric issue. And it actually exists in sport. So one of the reasons why not sport as an analogy is we look at winners and say, oh, they're winners. They must be a great team. Actually, there's lots of reasons why teams win. One is they can be a great team. They could have a transformational player. The other team could have had a bad day. But the metric we have is winning and losing. What we don't have is we don't have very good process metrics. And so what's really hard for leaders, and in particular human resources that often manage that succession planning, is what are the metrics that aren't growth or aren't profitability or aren't sales? What are the metrics that we have that we can make the selection on? And the reality is that we don't really have any. So I think it's a measurement issue. And also, if you said it's a risk issue, people want to mitigate their risk. That was the best sales guy. Make him the head of sales. That was the best functional or business unit president. Make her the CEO. Then it allows the leaders to be like, hold on, that wasn't my fault. They were the best salesperson. They was the best business unit leader. Wasn't my fault. Versus I make a judgment based on what we do. And actually, we do this with clients. People select on experience, skills, and outcomes. And we say none of those. Select on attributes for the future of the role. So I think there's a metric issue that we have that makes it hard for people to select for the future role.
I love the points that you made. First of all, Annie Duke also talks about resulting, where a lot of times we look at a result and then determine whether it was a right decision based on the result, as opposed to the likelihood of it working out or not. And she uses examples for Super Bowl and other instances where you can make the right play, but that right play can result in the team losing, and then people therefore question the play because of the result.
In sevens rugby, which is in the Olympics, which is the same rules of the game, but only 7 people, the bounce of the ball has a huge impact. So you can do everything right, but because there's so much space, you drop the ball, the other team picks it up, they score. It can be the change of the game. We undervalue in sport, but also in business, the impact of luck. We like to feel like we have control, but actually we don't have control. Like I have a client right now, new CEO, one of his business units is tanking. He could be amazing, but he's not going to move that. Like there isn't going to be growth. But he gets judged. He gets judged on the stock price. That stock price is judged on the results. Versus it being like, hold on, for the long-term success of this company, does this leader build the right cultures? Do they select the right leaders? Do they lead in a way that really maximizes their potential? All of those things is what you want to invest in. But because the market's down, they're down, like they might get fired. Luck is so much in our lives, we completely undervalue it.
Because we want to feel like we have a sense of control, and therefore we want to hold others accountable with a greater sense of control that we place on them.
That's right. I think accountability is key. And I also think it takes a strong owner, like set of shareholders, to say, we believe we're making a choice. We believe in something that we can't see. We believe in the intangibles. We believe in things that aren't concrete. That's a very strong choice. It's a lot easier to believe in the numbers. And I think that's hard.
You also, Pete, mentioned attributes. Rich Davigno has an outstanding book titled Attributes and makes the same point. He was a Navy SEAL commander for 20 plus years and had studied high functioning Navy SEALs teams. And part of what he also mentions is the need to focus more on attributes. Are there specific attributes that you hone in on when it comes to leadership? How do you determine what are the right attributes for the right roles?
So I think it's very contextual. The work that we do with clients is we say, what's the role? What do you want them to do? Therefore, what are the attributes that are required? So recently, we helped an organization internally select a C-suite. So it's like, all right, so what do you want this role to do? They wanted it to drive change, right? They wanted it to do some things differently. Okay, so an innovative thinker, someone who is a good communicator and storyteller. Like those are all things that are actually really hard to change. You could find someone that has done that work before, but that benefit goes away very quickly. 2 months into the job, 3 months into the job, they have the experience that you were selecting for. You can select for skills, but skills can be developed. So you can invest in someone to do that. But if you have someone who has the experience, and if you have someone who has the skills, but they're not an innovative thinker, and the role requires that as an attribute to get to the outcomes that the CEO or the board wants, they're not going to be successful. It doesn't matter how much experience. They have to have the right mindset and the right attributes.
What would be the difference between attributes and a skill set or experience that the person has shown through their behavior in the past that they've done similar things, which is part of what behavioral interviewing is all about?
So I'm with you. The way that you uncover attributes is through things like behavioral interviews, or you can do situational case studies. So there's ways of being able to identify them through their past. The difference is we need a CFO. This person's been a CFO before. For a large organization, we're looking for a CFO. The only people that we're going to look for are people that have been CFOs before. And I'm like, okay, you're going to restrict, especially if you're looking internally, to your business units that have been CFOs. It feels like a very different job to being a CFO of a business unit to be a CFO of the corporation. So to me, it's the role experience, not necessarily the situation. So the situation of someone who has led transformation before, let's investigate why they were successful and use that to uncover the attributes. But just because someone's been in the role before isn't useful. And by the way, most of the time when we come and work with clients, we have to completely rewrite whatever they had for their job description, because their job description is filled with experience and skills. And it's often backward looking, not future looking. It's not actually what you want the job to be. It's what the job is now. So I think there's a lot of work that leaders have to do and be really intentional about making those choices. We've helped just recently an organization select a chief people officer, and the person they ended up selecting had never been a chief people officer before, wasn't even in HR. Which I think you're going to see more of, by the way. I think you're going to see more of those enterprise-wide leaders in those roles. And by the way, the board wanted a CHRO. They wanted someone that had done it before. So it took the CEO going to the board and saying, that's not what we need. People can run the HR process. We need a business leader to head up our people, not an HR person to head up our people. So that's a great example of not using experience as the key indicator for a selection.
That is such an important point, Pete. The fact that we end up with mediocre people in roles when we look primarily at that experience. And a lot of organizations, as you said, limit the pool of people they're looking at and end up with someone mediocre as opposed to someone who has the attributes both for the present role and the future of the role.
Completely. Absolutely. Very different thinking. Again, talking to a client yesterday about this, they're bringing someone to head up their operations, and very progressive CEO. This person needs to be someone that can replace me in the next 5 years. That has to be a requirement. So I think that is a very wide aperture view of the role, thinking about it as an enterprise-wide leader, not thinking about it as a functional leader. And I think that's also one of the challenges that we have, is that we over-index in functional expertise, when actually the functional expertise lives in the function. We need leadership, enterprise-wide leadership, particularly in the C-suite.
Your definition and clarity with respect to attributes actually makes that practical, because as I said early on, most CEOs, most executives listen to this and agree. But when I see the practices are different, they gravitate back toward what's comfortable, which is that experience.
So when we've done this and we've had a client that's really bought into the process, we create scorecards around the different attributes, around the mindsets, because we have multiple different assessments that we use. And that creates comfort for the leaders because they have something that they see as tangible. Now, the input is what people thought in the interview. So it's intangible inputs, soft inputs, but actually giving them a score gives them confidence that they're making the right choice. So that's why I go all the way back to the metric. And what I will say is, and it's something that I've brought from coaching from sport into business, is that in sport, we measure everything for the players. We measure how far they run, how fast they run, how many hits they have. In a rugby game, we literally code everything a player does. We have data on everything. And I don't use that data as truth. I use that data to test what I call my coach's eye. So I have a belief from what I've seen in the game. And then I go back and I test my beliefs against the numbers. And that's what we do with our scorecards. Is it's not like the decision-making. It's, do these scores match up with what your leadership intuition says? And if the answer is yes, great. And if the answer is no, it's a red flag to say, let's pause. The person that you want didn't score very highly. Let's go and investigate it. It gives them a little bit of assurance that they're making the right choice.
So one of the people that I've been following for 6+ years is AJ Agrawal, wrote Prediction Machines and then Power and Prediction. I had him on the podcast last year, Pete. And AJ talks about the fact that AI drastically reduces the cost of prediction. And great decision-making is prediction plus judgment. What you are saying is you are gathering and using that data, and that's what AI, by the way, can be helpful with. Completely. And marrying that with the human judgment. It's not going just with the data, letting that decide, and it's not just relying on the judgment by itself.
That's absolutely right. And it's interesting because I actually think we're going to get to the point where we're going to have data that tests the AI judgment. AI is no different than us. We're thinking about stuff. We have experiences. We come up with some solutions. AI is going to be the same thing. And so we're going to need some judgments. And it's interesting. We're doing some work now with a couple of really progressive companies around prediction. And so we're doing something employee collective intelligence, which is how do you leverage the knowledge of your organization to predict the future? Because they actually know more. There's lots of research that says the crowd knows more than the experts. But in your organization, I think there's 80% of the knowledge that sits within someone is tacit. Only 20% gets accessed by the organization. So how do you leverage that? And then the other thing that we're doing as a way of being able to see into the future is agent-based modeling. And so we're actually doing it around trust, where we're building models of an organization and saying, okay, if you do this intervention, how does that impact trust within your organization? Now, it's not right because it's a model, and all models are wrong. But it, again, gives you, like you said, Mark, more data that allows you to then, therefore, have a better judgment about what you're going to do.
What powerful examples, what you just mentioned. I'll also reference Louis Rosenberg. He is CEO of Unanimous AI, has a couple of great TED Talks on swarm intelligence, the intelligence of the group, and how AI can help tap into the intelligence of the group. So what you're doing is helping tap into the intelligence of the collective of the employees for those organizations.
So AI for us is so much about, we can now turn qualitative data into quantitative data. We can theme things, much larger data sets. There's a lot of really interesting stuff that we can now do that's going to open up the data sets that we can leverage to help leaders make better decisions. And I think that's going to be really interesting. Our experience with employee collective intelligence has been, the data's good, but the leaders don't know how to use it. So employee collective intelligence can tell you what your attrition is going to be next quarter. And the interesting thing about crowdsourced forecasting is, it's not, Mahan, are you going to leave? It's no, are other people going to leave? Because you're having conversations with your friends who are like, this recruiter's calling me, and there's this really great offer over here, right? Oh, I'm going to go update my forecast. So I can tell you that attrition is going to go up next year, not to 100%, but it's pretty likely. Are you progressive enough and a thoughtful enough leader to do something about something that has not yet happened? Are you going to give bonuses? Are you going to restructure? What are you going to do? That's a really hard thing. And so our experience has been that most leaders aren't willing to do something. They're going to wait for it to happen. Then people have left, and now they're going to do something. And so we have to train the leaders to use this new data. It's going to come out of AI. It's going to come out of crowdsourced forecasting. We're going to use modeling. But the trick is to actually do something with that data before that prediction happens.
So I was reflecting on that as I was reading your book, Leadership Shock, Pete, in that sometimes leadership shock is when we are in new leadership roles. For a lot of leaders, we are going through leadership shock because of the transformation that's happening around us. So even
Absolutely.
for leaders who are in the same role, it's leadership shock.
That's right. You're absolutely right, Mahan. To me, it's about the context. Something has changed in your world, and now all of a sudden your calendar's crazy. You never feel like you do a good job. Your team's confused. Your stakeholders are asking you, what the hell are you doing? Like, you're just in this space because something has changed. You might be thinking about, I might now be like, leadership shock in the AI age, right? Because over the next 5 years, there's going to be so much transformation that if leaders are not intentional, and that's what authentic leadership model in Leadership Shock does, it helps you be intentional. If you're not intentional about how you lead, you're going to find yourself leading the way you did 2 years ago when your business was completely different, and wondering why you can't have an impact.
So one of the things that you mentioned, Pete, in trying to address that leadership shock is the need for deeper self-awareness, which is critical. But how can leaders develop that greater self-awareness?
When I work with a client, the first question I ask is, do you have the time? The answer is no, because they're in leadership shock. Are you willing to make the time? Are you willing to make the time, even just to meet with me, let alone do your own thinking? I think a lot of it's time, but I also don't feel like leaders value the time the way they should. Our time is our non-renewable resource, and we need to treat it like it's very precious. Whenever I work with leaders, they can't meet with me, so we go through their calendar, and I'll look out 2 months from now, and I'll be like, oh, this vendor, they're meeting with you 2 months from now. How did that get on the calendar? And the leader will say, oh, last week they called me, but I don't have time this week to meet with them. So I put them on the calendar 2 months from now. I'm like, a week before that meeting that you just put on the calendar, are you going to be busy that week? Our attitude is, time is precious now. Time tomorrow is less precious. Time 2 months from now, I can give it away. And so getting real discipline about time, I think, is important. The other thing, and this is a real challenge that we have in the post-COVID world, is that time used to be our commute. It used to be the time where we could really think, and now we don't have a commute. So I encourage my clients, create a virtual commute, go for a walk. So number one is time. And then two is really to understand the skill of metacognition, which is not just reflection, but thinking about why your reflection is what it is, to go deeper into not just, I want to be a servant leader, or I am a servant leader, or I really struggle with giving feedback. Okay, that's a reflection. but why do you struggle? And what is it in your past experience that has made feedback difficult for you? It's going those extra steps. And so in the book, there are some questions that gets you there. I'm not sure that you can get that without some support. It could be your spouse, it could be a mentor. There's someone that needs to challenge you a little bit. I actually think, Mahan, we talked about AI. I don't know if I'm going to be coaching 10 years from now, because there's going to be a Pete Steinberg AI bot that's going to take all of my coaching and ask all the right questions to the client. And hopefully I'm getting a percentage of whatever that company is that's doing that. So having the right questions and the responses is part of the process. So it's hard to do on your own. You don't need a coach, but you need someone that's really going to be helpful in pulling together your thoughts and challenging the way you think. So time and being metacognitive are really the two critical pieces.
Those add a lot of value. The piece that still adds value, and I don't know if AI will catch up in the foreseeable future with, it's a little bit like when I go to the gym, I see a lot of people who know exactly the routine they're supposed to go through and go through the same routine every single time with a trainer. Not because they need a trainer to teach them or work with them on a routine, but because the meetup with the trainer becomes a discipline for them to actually do the exercises and go through the routine.
So I talk to colleagues and partners that I partner with, and we have this conversation about AI. We come down to the personal connection is an important piece where you actually feel responsible to someone to do the things that you're supposed to do. I think some people in AI would be like, oh, we're going to do that. Like your bot's going to have a relationship with your client. It's going to feel real. That's what they say. But I do think AI can democratize coaching. So I do think that there's an opportunity. So exactly like there's the authentic leadership model. I'm expensive, capacity limited. I have a partner that does it too. She's expensive. She's capacity limited. But someone in their first managerial role, they could use the authentic leadership model to be successful. They could use that framework. So how do we democratize the executive coaching that can be just in time to help people? And I think that's where generative AI can really go well.
What a great way of putting it. To a great extent, knowledge and information has been democratized. Now, one of the other things that you also go into, Pete, is the ability for leaders to effectively delegate in order to be able to manage their workload. What, in your experience, typically gets in the way of that effective delegation?
The first one is obvious, and you come across it all the time. And we actually already talked about it, Mahan, which is their expertise in their previous role. So one of the things that is really challenging, and I think gets people into leadership shock. Let's take our CFO example. I was the CFO, and now I'm the business unit, and now I'm the CFO of the enterprise, not just the business unit. But my self-identity is wrapped up in my expertise as a financial professional. Therefore, when I take a C-suite role that's enterprise-wide, I still want all of the information I had as a business unit CFO. But now I get it from 8 business units. So now I'm working on Sundays to try and review all of these financials. Like, you have to fundamentally change your mindset. I am no longer a financial expert. I am now a leader of the financial organization. Therefore, you really have to understand not what's my value, what am I good at, but what am I good at in the role that I currently have? What's the strength that I'm bringing to this? It is not being a financial professional. That is not the strength. Therefore, I should not be spending time reviewing the finances of the different business units. That's no longer your job. So one is letting go of your identity. The second thing is having clear priorities that get you where you want to go. And this is where we get into the intentionality. So I think there's a chunk of your calendar, maybe it's a third. I'll just use it as an example. You don't have control over. Your boss puts time on it. There's other things like the monthly meetings, it's the forecasting, it's the team meetings. You don't have control over that. There's a third, which is probably things that you need to do as a leader in your role. Now, there's some work you can do there. And then there's a third that you have a lot of discretion over. Understanding which of the roles that you have, like where the meetings fit, will allow you to manage your calendar, and it will allow you to delegate. So this goes a little bit back to the rugby experience. Actually delegate, the CFO letting the new CFO of the business unit that they used to run do their job is maybe the hardest thing you do when you transition. So being really intentional, if you can reframe the role that you have, then you can get things off your calendar. When things go off your calendar, the people that are in that meeting have to step up. You give them space to lead. I talk a lot about leadership space. You can fill as much of the leadership space or not fill it. Have it be intentional. So let your team lead by giving them space to lead and find ways to monitor and support. So being intentional about your priorities, looking at your time, getting out of those meetings, and then being really explicit to your team that you want them to lead, you're giving them that space. That's the way to probably do it.
A couple of the things that you mentioned, I wanted to highlight. I see that a lot of times in organizations, when the CEO has a specific background or particular interest, they're a lot more involved in it than they should be for a CEO. And then secondarily, we all tend to have way more priorities than we can handle, and then wonder why we don't do as good a job with any of them. Those can be very impactful.
Yeah, that's right. The interest one is really interesting. And that's why really creating a clear vision of what you want and your priorities. And people that are overwhelmed, I don't think have clarity in their role. Now, you can be overwhelmed for short periods of time. So there can be a crisis, there can be a fire. But when you are always overwhelmed, you're in leadership shock. Like when it's been 6 months, then that's not sustainable. And you're not doing a good job. So it's almost like, Mahan, they say a good strategy tells you what you should do. A great strategy tells you what you shouldn't do. A good leadership model tells you what you do. A great leadership model tells you what you shouldn't do. And so as soon as you've chosen what you shouldn't do, and by the way, you should never choose something because you're the best person to do it if you're in the C-suite. Terrible reason to do it. You're not there as an expert. You're there as a leader. So I just think that having clarity around your leadership model that tells you what you shouldn't do is going to clean up your calendar. I worked with a CEO. Calendar was crazy, leadership shock. Eventually, she got to the point that she had 2 hours a day where she could think every day. Now, sometimes it gets crazy, stuff happens, but 2 hours a day where her EA said, this is protected, this is thinking time, reading time, reflection time. And it was a 2-year journey to get there. But that's someone who had real clarity about what she wanted to do and also real clarity about what she expected from a team, and a team understood it. She's not there to run the business as the CEO. She's there to lead the business. And that's different.
What an outstanding experience. And I love the point that you made, Pete. If at any point in time you're in leadership shock, that's fine. We all go through that. But if 6 months ago you were also in leadership shock and a year ago you were in leadership shock, then maybe it's something about the system and your approach to it.
Right.
And so from an organizational perspective, would love to hear your thoughts, Pete, on how organizations can support leaders in transition.
The first thing I would say is don't let them wear 2 hats. Like in many cases, you get the job, but you have to do the old job. If you want to be really good, give them a month off. Give them a month off, have them go and explore, have them go and spend time with competitors, with clients, get them to really think about what they want to do. And I'm not joking. I think that especially for the senior levels, giving people a mini sabbatical, having them recharge will be super impactful. And it's not like a month off. No, there are things that you're doing, but the things you are doing are prepping you for the next role. I struggle to understand this, Mahan. You knew this was going to happen a year ago. This person was going to retire. You knew it, but it was never a priority until the day before that person retired. Now, all of a sudden, the person that you're going to put into that role has to do 2 jobs while you spend 3 months trying to replace them. And it's a terrible way to start the role. You just can't do the job very well. So I think seeing things as an investment in performance is probably the big thing. But at the very least, giving people some transition time. And how can I do less of the things that don't fit that? And I think that's the starting point. But finding some time to do that when you're in shock is very difficult.
You gave everyone outstanding starting points for the audience to both find out more about your book and follow you and your work, Pete, where would you send them to?
Connect with me on LinkedIn. You'll see that there's a lot of things that I share on LinkedIn. And then if you go to petesteinberg.com, there's a newsletter that comes out that talks about these leadership challenges and leadership shocks. So those are probably the two best places to connect with me.
I really appreciate both the conversation and your thoughts, Pete, because as I referenced earlier, we're all going through leadership shock, whether in new roles or in existing roles, which is why it becomes even more important for us to use that authenticity to be able to stay close to our purpose and be able to navigate well.
Absolutely. You've summarized it very well, Mahan.
I really appreciate the conversation. Thank you so much, Pete Steinberg.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.